He wrote that he would summer with his mistress, and no answer had come. The words reached Hester Wren before she meant to hear them, carried through the half-open door of the estate office on Mr. Tolliver's reading voice, pitched for an audience of one. She stood on the threshold with a stoppered bottle of ink in her hand, and did not move, and did not breathe any louder than the dust moved in the window's shaft of light. Mr. Silas Farrell stood at the map table with his back to her, turning his signet ring round and round his finger, the way another man might turn a key in a lock that was not his own. She would remember, afterward, that she had come in only for ink and had left carrying a fact heavy enough to take the roof off the house. Had she known what it would cost her to carry it, she would have picked up the bottle all the same. Hester Wren had been 25 years overlooked, and she had made a discipline of it, the way another woman might make a discipline of prayer. She was companion to Miss Faith Farrell, 15 and motherless, and she kept the schoolroom accounts, because no one else at Aldermere Hall thought accounts worth keeping, and it was this habit, this eye trained since childhood by a father who had spent his life reading other men's handwriting for a country bank, that let her see at a glance that the paper in Tolliver's hand was a copy. Not an original, the loops too round, too patient, a hand copying rather than a hand thinking. She filed the observation the way she filed everything, without expression, and withdrew before the ring stopped turning. 29 days remained until Michaelmas, when the trust her father's old employer had drawn for the Varell estate would mature and pass whole into Julian Varell's own hand, and until that day his cousin Silas held the keys, the ledgers, and, it seemed, the letters. She had heard he was expected back within the week from his rounds of the outlying farms. She did not yet know that he had already been gone 11 days longer than he had told anyone he would be, or that the cottage he rode out to twice a week, rain or shine, stood past the old mill on land nobody but Silas Farrell had cause to walk. Faith found her in the passage a moment later, breathless with a hoop she had abandoned mid-roll, and asked whether it was true that Julian had gone off to some woman near the sea, because Cook had heard it from the carrier, who had heard it from someone at the Crossroads Inn, and the whole house seemed to be assembling the rumor out of its component parts before dinner. Hester told her that carriers were paid to deliver flour, not truth, and that the two rarely traveled in the same cart. Faith laughed, because Hester's dryness always startled a laugh out of her, but she did not entirely stop looking troubled, and Hester privately did not blame her. She had learned early that survival, for a woman with no fortune and no beauty anyone remarked upon, lay in being small, in sitting where the light did not find her, in speaking last, in keeping her opinions filed alongside the household's spent candle stubs, useful only in the dark. Better a wren than a peacock, her father used to say. No one wrings a plain bird's neck for its feathers. She had built a whole life on that single sentence, and until this summer, it had never once failed her. She did not yet know that it was about to. That evening, she carried Faith's mending down to the small parlor and found Mrs. Pettigrew there ahead of her, turning down the lamp wicks with the brisk contempt of a woman who had run this house since before Julian Varell could walk in it. Mrs. Pettigrew had opinions about everything, and voiced perhaps a third of them, which by the standards of Aldermere made her practically silent. She asked, without looking up, whether Hester had heard the talk. Hester said she had heard a version of it. "There is only ever one version that travels," said Mrs. Pettigrew, "and it is never the true one. The true one is too slow on its feet." She said it the way she said most things, flatly, as though reciting a fact about the weather, and went on trimming the wick, and Hester filed that sentence away too, not knowing yet how many times she would need it before autumn. 29 days to Michaelmas. A letter that was not what it seemed, copied in a hand too patient to be honest. A cousin who turned his ring like a key, and a master of the house who had not been seen in 11 days, whose absence was already being spent by other people, as though it were coin they had every right to. Julian Varel came home on a Tuesday with dust on his boots to the ankle, and said almost nothing at dinner, which was not unusual, except that he did not look at Hester once. She found him afterward in the library, standing at the window with his hands laced behind him in the particular stillness he wore like a coat when something had gone wrong, and he had not yet decided how much of it to admit. She had brought Faith's arithmetic slate under the pretense of a question about fractions, and she set it on the table between them like a flag of truce neither of them had asked for. "You have been gone 11 days longer than you said," she told him, "because someone in this house had better say it plainly, and it may as well be the one nobody will miss if you throw her out for it." He turned, and something in his face closed the way a ledger closes when a man has found a figure he does not like. "I do not account to the household for my movements, Miss Wren," he said. "No," she agreed, "you account to no one. Which is precisely the trouble, because in your silence other people are writing your accounts for you, and they are not being kind with the ink." He was quiet long enough that she thought she had gone too far, had spent the small currency of her position on a purchase she could not afford. Then he said, low, that there were things he could not yet lay before her, or before anyone, and that he would ask her to trust the shape of a man she had known 2 years, rather than the shape of a rumor she had known 2 days. "That is not an answer," she said. "It is the only one I have to give at present," he said, "and I will not manufacture a better one merely because the truth is inconvenient to my comfort." She found, unwillingly, that she respected him more for the refusal than she would have for a smoother lie, and said so, which surprised them both. He asked, then, why she troubled herself with his affairs at all, when by her own account she made a study of staying out of everyone's. "Because your sister asked me a question at 4 o'clock that I did not know how to answer honestly," she said, "and I dislike lying to children. It is bad practice, and worse arithmetic." That drew, unexpectedly, the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth, gone before it became a smile, and she found she had noticed it the way one notices the first bird before dawn, a small thing, disproportionately loud in the quiet. He told her, in retrospect and reluctantly, enough of the frame without the picture, that his father had died owing more attention to the estate's books than he had ever paid them, that Silas had managed everything competently, and Julian had believed until lately, honestly, and that something in the timber accounts this spring had not sat right in his stomach, a discrepancy small enough to explain away, and persistent enough that he had stopped trying. He did not tell her about the cottage past the mill. She did not ask him to account further, because she had already taken more than her position entitled her to, and because Mrs. Pettigrew's maxim was proving itself before she had even finished testing it, the true version was slow on its feet, and she suspected she had only heard the first quarter-mile of it. Before she left the library he said, abruptly, that he kept his own counsel as a rule, because counsel shared was counsel spent, and he had few enough resources this year to spend anything freely. She told him that was a poor economy for a man with a sister who loved him and a household that would follow him into a fire if he asked it properly. He said nothing to that, only looked at her a moment too long for a man merely closing a conversation, and she went up to bed turning his silence over the way she turned over a column that would not balance, certain the error was there, certain she had not yet found which line held it. Silas Varel was gentlest exactly when he meant the most harm, and Hester learned this properly 3 days later in the estate office, where he had asked her, with a courtesy so complete it amounted to a kind of violence, whether she would be so good as to look over a page of the household ledger, since her hand for figures was, he understood, unusually reliable for a woman in her position. She did not care for the phrase her position, delivered as it was with a small, appreciative smile, as though he were complimenting a dog for fetching competently. She looked over the page. It concerned linen and candles and small quarterly disbursements, entirely dull, entirely correct, and she said so. He thanked her with the same smile and mentioned, as though it had only just occurred to him, that it was a pity dear Julian had been so occupied this summer with matters outside the estate, and that he did hope, for the family's sake, that whatever kept him from home was worth the talk it was generating in the village. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. The threat lived entirely in the courtesy, in the way he set the ledger's corner exactly square to the desk's edge before he let go of it. And Hester understood, with the particular chill of a woman recognizing a predator by its stillness rather than its noise, that she had just been warned to keep to her place, phrased so pleasantly that she would spend an hour deciding whether she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. That week, the talk in the village thickened from a rumor into something with edges. Miss Amelia Grange, who called at Aldermere with a basket of her mother's compliments and a great deal more curiosity than the compliments required, sat in the small parlor and asked, with her beautiful, cold composure, whether it was true Mr. Farrell had taken a house near the coast for a lady no one had been permitted to meet. She asked it the way one asks a question already believing the answer, testing only how the asking would land. Hester told her she had not been informed, which was true in the letter and false in the spirit, and Miss Grange's smile suggested she understood the distinction perfectly and did not mind exploiting it. After she left, Hester sat a long while with the ledger Silas had shown her, because something about it had continued to itch at her, the way a wrongly carried figure itches at a trained eye long after the page is closed. She could not say what. The totals were correct. But a column can be made to say anything, her father used to tell her, if a man holds the pen and no one is watching him hold it. And she found herself wondering, for the first time with real unease, who held this particular pen, and whether anyone in this house was watching him do it. She noted, almost idly, that the quarterly timber entry, 3 pages further on, in a section she had not been asked to review, carried a hand very slightly rounder than the rest of the book, patient, careful, copied, rather than composed. The same hand, she was nearly certain, that had produced the letter Tolliver had read aloud in June. She said nothing of it to anyone. She only turned down the corner of the page, very slightly, the way her father had taught her to mark a line worth returning to, and went up to see to Faith's lessons with the small, cold clarity of a woman who has just heard. Faintly. The first note of a tune she does not yet know the words to. The household accounts became, without either of them quite arranging it, a reason for Julian and Hester to sit an hour together most evenings at the long table in the estate office, heads bent over the same columns, her pencil and his pen moving in a silence that stopped being awkward somewhere in the second week, and became, instead, companionable in a way she had not expected and did not entirely trust. He had a way of reading a line of figures with his lips barely moving, as though tasting them for soundness, and she found she liked watching him do it more than she liked admitting she watched him do anything. One evening, over a set of accounts for the home farm, she caught an error he had made twice running, a shilling misplaced into the wrong column, and pointed it out without softening it, because she had never learned to soften anything, and saw no reason to begin with him. He looked at the figure, then at her, and said that she was the only person in this house who corrected him as though she expected him to survive it. She told him most people mistook flattery for kindness and confused both with usefulness, and she had no patience for any of the three. He laughed. It was not a large laugh, only a short exhale through the nose and a genuine crease at the eye, but she marked it the way she marked the timber entry, with a small private notation she did not examine too closely, first time. He seemed startled by it himself, as though the sound were unfamiliar in his own throat, and for a moment the graveness he wore like armor slipped enough that she saw, briefly, a much younger man underneath it. One who had laughed more before he had learned that laughing cost something in a house that required constant vigilance. "That is the first time I have heard you do that since I came here," she said, before she could stop herself. He said that was likely true, and that he was not certain it reflected well on either the house or him. She asked whether he meant to remedy that. He said he was uncertain he had the leisure this year, and something in his voice closed the subject before it had properly opened, the graveness settling back over him like a lowered visor. She did not push. She had learned, in her own small life, the exact weight a person could bear being pushed before they broke, rather than opened, and she judged, correctly, that he was near that weight already. Instead, she asked, carefully, whether whatever kept him occupied this summer was going well. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would deflect again. Then he said, low, that there was a debt he owed someone who had given him everything and asked nothing back, and that he meant to pay it properly before the summer ended, whatever it cost him elsewhere. He said there was a great deal he could not yet tell her, and that he was aware how that sounded, given the talk in the village, and that he was sorry for the position it put her in, though he stopped short of saying why her position in it should trouble him particularly. She told him she did not require an accounting of his conscience, only enough facts to keep Faith's questions answerable. That was not entirely true, and she suspected he knew it was not entirely true, because something in his expression when he looked at her then was not the look of a man discussing his sister's arithmetic. He said, quietly, that he valued more than he had said aloud how she never once, in all the talk that had reached this house, had asked him outright whether the rumor was true. She said she had considered it beneath both of them. He said he did not think anything about her was beneath consideration, and then seemed to hear himself, and looked down at the ledger as though it had suddenly become urgently interesting, and she let him have the retreat, because she required one herself, her pulse doing something undisciplined that she had no figure in any column to account for. The blow, when it came dressed as an invitation. The Grange family held their harvest supper a fortnight later, and half the parish attended, and Silas Farrell arrived in a coat so immaculate it seemed to reproach every other coat in the room, and within an hour of the soup he had contrived, with an artistry Hester could only afterward admire the way one admires a well-laid trap. To have the letter itself produced, not the copy Tolliver had read in June, but what he presented, smiling, as the original, passed hand to hand at a card table under cover of a wager about whose penmanship was finer. He read a line aloud himself, in the gentlest voice in the room, the very line Hester had first heard through a doorway. He wrote that he would summer with his mistress. He let the silence do the rest. Miss Grange's composure cracked into something close to triumph, and half the table's eyes found Hester where she sat with Faith, as though she were the wronged party required to perform an emotion for their benefit. She did not perform one. She sat very still, and said, when someone was unwise enough to ask her directly what she made of it, that she made nothing of a single sentence torn out of a letter she had not seen whole, and that she had been taught a column meant nothing without the rest of the ledger around it. It was a smaller answer than she wanted to give, and it did not stop the room's appetite, but it bought her the width of the evening. Worse than the letter was what followed it. Silas turned with the same gentle smile to Hester herself, and observed, to the table at large, how fortunate it was that Aldermary had a companion with such a trained eye for handwriting and figures, Had she not, only last month, helped him confirm the household accounts were sound? She felt the trap close around her own competence before she understood its shape. He was using the very thing she was proudest of, quietly, publicly, to attach her name to his ledgers as a witness who had already vouched for them, so that whatever discrepancy might later surface would have to climb over her own testimony to be believed. She understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air, that her skill, offered freely and in good faith, had just been turned into a weapon aimed back at the one person in that house she most wanted to protect. She said nothing to correct him in front of the table, because there was nothing yet to say that would not sound like the flailing of a woman caught out, but she left the supper early, with Faith drooping against her arm, and rode home, turning the whole evening over and over, hunting the line where the error truly lived. What looked, an hour ago, like a private study she had taken up out of pride and habit, now looked like a door she had unknowingly held open for the very harm she meant to guard against. She thought of the timber entry with its rounder hand. She thought of Silas's ring turning like a key. Somewhere between the mill and the gates of Aldermere she understood, with the particular vertigo of watching a floor that had seemed solid reveal itself as a trapdoor, that whatever safety she had believed the house afforded her had never existed at all, and that she had walked into the middle of a design far older and colder than a summer's gossip. Julian was not at the supper, which everyone remarked upon and no one explained, and he was not at breakfast the next morning either, and by the second evening of his continued absence the house had stopped pretending the silence was ordinary. Hester found Silas in the library that night, standing exactly where Julian had once stood at that same window, and she understood the substitution was not accidental. He told her, with real warmth in his voice, that he had been meaning to speak with her privately, that her position at Aldermere was precarious now the household's name had become a subject of parish supper, and that he had it in his power, as acting master of the estate until Michaelmas, to secure her a very comfortable situation elsewhere. A companion's post with a widowed connection of his in Bath, generous wages, no scandal attached to her name at all, and a small sum besides, for her trouble in having been so patient with this difficult summer. He set the figure on the desk between them, written on a card, and it was not a small figure. She looked at it a long moment. Then she told him she had not realized her patience carried a price, and that she found she did not care to sell it, because the moment she did, she would no longer be able to tell anyone, including herself, that she had stayed at Aldermere for any reason but the money he had just offered her to leave it. He said that was a great deal of principle for a woman with no fortune of her own. She said principle was the only fortune available to a woman with no fortune of her own, and she was not inclined to spend her sole asset on his convenience. He did not raise his voice, and his smile did not move, but something behind his eyes recalculated her. Quickly, the way a man recalculates a sum he had been certain would come out differently. She left the library with her hands steady and her legs considerably less so, and she understood she had just refused something that would matter later, though she could not yet have said how. Only that she had looked at an easy exit bought with her own integrity and found she would rather keep the integrity and go hungry for the exit. That understanding cost her something real. It cost her the last of her certainty that this summer would resolve itself gently, and it cost her, that night, any sleep at all, because somewhere past midnight, Mrs. Pettigrew came to her door with a face gone the color of ash and a scrap of paper, half burnt at one edge, that she said she had pulled from the office grate not an hour before, when she had gone down for the last of the coal. "Read it, Mrs." Pettigrew said, and did not sit down, which was itself alarming, because Mrs. Pettigrew sat down for everything. Hester read it by the candle. It was in Silas's own hand, a fragment of a letter to Tolliver, unfinished or abandoned, that spoke of the copy being ready in good time, of the timber sale needing to close before Michaelmas, while there was no one left at Aldermere with authority to question it, and of Julian being, in Silas's own chosen word, occupied elsewhere long enough to serve. Hester sat with the scrap in her 2 hands and felt the whole shape of the summer rearrange itself around her. The letter, the ledger, the supper, the offer in the library, all of it a single design rather than a season's bad luck, and she understood that Julian's continued absence was no longer merely painful, but urgent, because a man who could arrange gossip so precisely could arrange worse. And she did not know, in that moment, whether he was hiding or hindered or already beyond her help entirely. She sent a boy to the cottage past the mill before first light, because it was the only address she had ever heard connected to Julian's summer, gathered second-hand from the carrier Faith had quoted weeks before, and she told herself she was not afraid while she waited, which was not true, and she did not believe it any more than Mrs. Pettigrew did, sitting across from her with a cup of tea neither of them drank. The boy came back at noon with dust on his boots and nothing else. The cottage stood empty, he said. No smoke from the chimney, the garden gone to seed. A neighbor woman who told him the old lady who'd lived there had died near 3 weeks back and been buried quiet, and the gentleman who used to visit had come once after, stood a long while at the gate, and gone off toward the posting road, without leaving word where. 3 weeks. Hester did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way she did all arithmetic, and found that 3 weeks placed Julian's true absence squarely across the very fortnight the letter had first surfaced, meaning he had likely never seen the copy at all, had no notion what was being said of him in every parlor from Aldermere to the Grange's supper table, had perhaps received no letters from home whatsoever, since she now understood precisely who controlled the postbag that left this house. No answer had come from him in weeks, not because he had chosen silence, but because, she was suddenly certain, no one had ever let a question reach him. She wrote to him that same hour, to the posting inn nearest the cottage, on the chance he had lodged there, and said only that he was needed at home, that his sister missed him, and that whatever debt he had gone to pay, he ought to know what was being said of him while he paid it. She gave the letter to Mrs. Pettigrew's own nephew to carry, not the estate post, and told him to put it in no hand but the innkeeper's own. Then there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting, she found, was its own particular cruelty, because it left room for every fear she had been too occupied to feel until now, that he had been set upon on some lonely road, that grief for the old woman had broken something in him the accounts could not repair, that he had heard the gossip after all, from some stranger at an inn, and believed the house he loved had condemned him in his absence without troubling to send a single line in his defense. She thought of Silas's fragment, of the words no one left at Aldermere with authority to question it, and understood with a coldness that reached her feet that Michaelmas was now only 11 days off, that a trust matured on a fixed date whether or not the man it belonged to stood in the room to claim it, and that a design patient enough to forge a letter was patient enough to make very sure he did not arrive in time. She did not sleep that night either. She sat at the schoolroom window with the half-burnt scrap in her lap and watched the dark for a light on the posting road, and asked herself the one question she could not yet answer and would not be able to answer until she had proof solid enough to set before witnesses whether the man she had come, against every rule she had built her small safe life on, to love without meaning to, was still within reach of being saved, or whether the house that had swallowed his old nurse whole this summer had already, in its patient and gentle way, swallowed him too. He came back on the 9th day before Michaelmas, gaunt and travel-worn and entirely alive, and Hester's relief at the sight of him from the schoolroom window was so total that she had to sit down before she trusted her legs to carry her downstairs. He had gotten her letter 3 days late, forwarded from an inn to an inn, and had ridden the last 30 miles nearly without stopping. He told her, in the library, in a voice stripped of its usual grave control, that he had heard the talk himself only once, from a stranger who did not know who he was speaking to, and had believed for 2 black days that the woman he loved had heard it too, and thought the worst without waiting for him to speak. She told him she had never once believed it, not from the first hour, and that she had spent the summer proving it instead of merely feeling it, which she considered the more useful of the two. He asked what she had proven. She laid it before him, without softening any of it, the copy in a hand too patient to be honest, the timber entry in the same rounder hand 3 pages past where he'd been asked to look, the offer in the library dressed as kindness, the fragment from the grate in Silas's own writing, naming the sale, naming Michaelmas, naming him, in his own cousin's pen, as merely occupied elsewhere long enough to serve. Julian went very still reading it, the stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it, and then he said, quietly, that he had suspected the timber for a year and never once suspected the letter was part of the same design, because he had been too ready to believe his own family incapable of that particular cruelty. Hester told him that was not a flaw in him. It was only proof he had not yet learned what she had learned early, that the gentlest voice in a room was very often the most dangerous one in it. He asked her then why she had risked so much, her place, her safety, the very security she had built her whole self around, for a man who had given her, by his own admission, nothing but silence and a debt he would not explain. She told him she had considered that question at some length on a sleepless night with a burnt scrap of paper in her lap, and had concluded that a safety built on never risking anything was not safety at all, only a slower kind of loss, and that she had decided, somewhere in the last 11 days. She would rather risk everything on the true shape of a man than keep everything by trusting a rumor. He crossed the room and took both her hands, which he had never once done, and said that whatever came of Michaelmas, he wanted her to know that first, before anything else was settled, because he was not certain he would find the courage to say it once the fighting began. She told him to save his courage for the fighting and say the rest of it after, because they had 9 days to prove a case before witnesses, and sentiment, however welcome, would not forge a signature back into truth. He laughed, briefly, roughly, and said she really was the only person in this house who corrected him, as though she expected him to survive it. And she said she fully intended for him to survive it, and meant to see to the proving herself. They rode to Mr. Aubrey Fenn, the family's solicitor, 2 days later, with everything Hester had gathered laid out between them like evidence at an inquest, the burnt fragment, the timber page with its telltale rounder hand, the letter Julian had actually written to Fenn in June, the true one, which Fenn himself produced from his own files, still sealed. Because it had arrived at his office and been read and answered, and the answer, it now seemed clear, had never reached Julian at all, intercepted somewhere on the road home the way every other honest word between them had been intercepted that summer. Fenn read the true letter aloud in his own office, and the line that had traveled the parish as scandal read, in full. Entirely differently, I go to summer with my old mistress, meaning dear Mistress Coombe, who raised me before my own mother had the chance to, and I mean to see her comfortably to the end of her days, whatever it costs me elsewhere, for I owe her everything, and she has asked me for nothing in 30 years. Folded inside the letter, pressed flat, was a sprig of rosemary gone brittle and gray, and along the letter's margin, in a hand small enough to have escaped a careless copyist entirely, ran a second message meant only for Fenn's eyes. Watch the timber figures. Cousin's hand is not always his own. I will bring proof by my Kelmas. Fenn set the letter down and said, quietly, that he had wondered for weeks why his own reply had gone unanswered, and now understood exactly whose hand had made certain it never left the house. Hester felt the last piece settle into place with the particular satisfaction of a column finally balancing after a long search for the missing shilling. Mrs. Pettigrew, sent for and questioned gently, admitted she had seen Tolliver more than once carrying letters to the office grate rather than the post bag, and had thought nothing of it at the time because a housekeeper does not question a clerk's errands, only regretted now that she had not thought harder, sooner. Fenn said the discrepancy in the timber accounts, cross-checked now against the true entries Julian had quietly kept in a second private ledger all summer. The debt he had not been able to explain even to Hester amounted to a sum large enough to constitute outright theft from the estate, compounded by the forgery of at least one signature authorizing the sale. He said, with the flat calm of a man who has spent 30 years watching families destroy themselves and has stopped being surprised by it, that this could be settled quietly, in his own office, with a private accounting and a discreet departure. Or it could be settled properly, before witnesses, with the truth read aloud where the whole parish that had condemned Julian on a stolen sentence could hear the sentence restored to its proper shape. Hester looked at Julian. Julian looked, for a long moment, like a man weighing the comfort of quiet against the cost of every person in the county who had watched him tried and found wanting by gossip without ever being permitted to watch him cleared. Then he said that a wound made in public required a cure made in public too, or it would never fully close, and Hester felt something in her chest unclench that she had not known was still clenched, because it was, precisely, the answer she would have given herself. Michaelmas fell on a gray morning that broke into a hard, clean rain by noon, and Aldermere's long hall filled with more of the parish than the trust reading strictly required, because word had traveled, as word always did, that something more than a signature would be settled that day. Silas arrived immaculate as ever, dove-gray and composed, his ring turning once, twice. As he took his place near the fire, and Hester watched him note the crowded room and recalculate, visibly, the odds of an afternoon he had clearly expected to be a formality. Fenn opened with the trust itself, dry business, dates and figures, and then, without raising his voice any more than Silas ever had, said there remained one matter of the household's honor that could not, in conscience, be left unresolved while so many present had formed an opinion upon incomplete evidence. He held up 2 letters side by side into the gray light from the tall windows. This, he said, is the copy that traveled this parish all summer. This is the original, from my own files, sealed until 3 days ago. He read them both aloud, the false excerpt first, then the whole true sentence with its rosemary and its debt of love, and the room's silence had a different texture by the second reading than it had had for the first. He asked Mr. Tolliver, seated near the wall in a coat too warm for the weather, to step forward and confirm which hand had produced the copy that had circulated. Tolliver said, faintly, that he could not be certain. Fenn asked him only one further question, mild as milk, whose instruction had he been copying under, that June evening in the estate office, when he first read that sentence aloud to Mr. Silas Varell. Tolliver's composure did not survive the question. He said Silas's name before he had visibly decided to say anything at all, and then, having broken, could not stop breaking, and the whole design came out of him in a rush, the copying, the burning of the true replies. The timber sale meant to close quietly before Michaelmas, while Julian was believed occupied elsewhere. Fenn reads Silas's own unfinished letter last, the fragment from the grate. In Silas's own unmistakable hand, the phrase occupied elsewhere long enough to serve landing in that hall, with the flat finality of a door shutting. Silas did not shout, and did not run, and for a moment merely stood very still, with his hand closed hard around his ring, and something in his face, briefly, was not calculation at all, but a much older grief, and he said, low, that he had done it to keep his own sister from the workhouse after her husband's debts came due. That he had told himself a season's borrowing against Julian's timber was no true theft if he meant to repay it before anyone noticed, and that he had gone on telling himself that long after it had stopped being true. It did not excuse him, and no one in that hall mistook it for an excuse, but Hester, watching him, felt the pity settle over her that the darkest verdicts always seemed to leave room for, and understood that the room felt it too. Julian did not have him charged. He said, before the assembled parish, that his cousin would be granted a modest allowance and passage to a cousinly connection in the north, on the single condition that he never again hold pen or ledger for any family's trust, and that this was not mercy earned, but mercy given, because the estate had enough grief in it already, without adding a public ruin to settle a private one. Silas left the hall that afternoon a broken and considerably smaller man, and no one present, Hester noted, felt the satisfaction they had expected to feel in watching him go. Julian found Hester afterward in the library, in the same gray light, and said that he had a debt still owing that he intended to pay before the day ended, though this one he meant to name plainly. He told her he loved her, and had for longer than he had permitted himself to admit, and that he was asking her to marry him now, with the estate secured and the trust settled, and nothing left for either of them to gain by the answer except each other, precisely so that she would never have cause to wonder whether he asked her for her usefulness, or her proof, or her silence, the way this whole summer had asked so much of her, for so little in return. "Marry me because you wish it," he said. "It is the only reason I will take." She told him that he had once said he kept his own counsel because counsel shared was counsel spent, and that she had thought about that sentence more than was good for her peace of mind all summer. "Then spend it," she said. "I find I have decided I want the coin." They were married quietly, 6 weeks later, in the small stone church at Fenbrook, with Faith weeping happily through the whole of it and Mrs. Pettigrew weeping considerably less happily and considerably more loudly, and Mr. Fenn giving the bride away in the absence of any father to do it, and Amelia Grange, who had come that autumn to make her own amends after watching the whole design unravel and finding her own part in spreading it harder to forgive than she had expected, sitting near the back in a plain bonnet, considerably less cold than she had been in June, and considerably more welcome at Aldermere than she had any right to expect, because Hester had found, in the wake of everything, that she had very little appetite left for holding grudges against anyone who had merely repeated a lie rather than authored one. Tolliver, stripped of his post but spared the magistrate at Julian's word, took a clerkship in a distant county, and was never heard from at Aldermere again. Mistress Coomb's cottage was left standing, its gardens slowly reclaimed and replanted under Hester's direction, its little gate mended, because Julian said a debt of love did not end merely because the woman it was owed to had died, and Hester agreed, and thought it was very like him to say so. Nearly a year later, in the high heat of the following summer, Hester stood again at the door of the estate office with a stoppered bottle of ink in her hand, and heard voices inside, not a clerk reading a stolen sentence this time, but Julian reading aloud to Faith from a letter of his own composing. laughing. Actually laughing. At some small joke buried in his own dry prose, and Hester stood a moment in the doorway exactly as she had a year before, and did not move, and did not need to, because there was nothing this time worth overhearing in secret, only a house with all its true letters finally reaching all their true addresses, and a wren singing somewhere past the open window in the kind of ordinary, undramatic light that a year ago she would not have believed she was allowed to keep. Better a wren than a peacock, she thought, and, for the first time in her whole plain, careful life, did not feel the sentence as an instruction to stay small, only as an old truth grown gentle with use. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself hoping, the way I did while I wrote it, that the quiet ones are the ones worth watching closest, then stay a while longer by the fire with me. The kettle's on, the chair by the hearth is kept, and I would love to know in the comments which line stayed with you longest, or what you'd have done at the gate of that empty cottage, waiting for word. If you'd like more evenings like this one, consider staying close and subscribing so there's always a place kept for you here. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle with the quiet ones who have been carrying more than they've said.